The air inside the labyrinth was cool and damp, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and stone that had been untouched for centuries, or perhaps even longer. The beams of their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating narrow tunnels that twisted and turned like veins in a giant underground body. Daniel Carter adjusted the strap of his backpack and glanced at the others behind him. His team consisted of 5 people, each chosen for their expertise in different fields. They were deep beneath the surface now, miles away from sunlight and fresh air, exploring what many believed to be nothing more than an old myth. Rachel Monroe walked beside him, her notebook clutched tightly in one hand. She was the linguist of the group, brought along because of her knowledge of ancient symbols and languages. Her eyes darted around constantly, taking in every detail of the walls as if expecting them to speak to her. Behind her came Laura Bennett, a biologist who seemed more interested in the tiny organisms clinging to the rocks than the actual structure of the labyrinth itself. Then there was Jake Miller, the engineer, whose job was to ensure all their equipment worked properly. Bringing up the rear was Kevin Hayes, a historian who had spent years studying legends about this place but never imagined he'd actually set foot inside it. For hours they had been walking, mapping out sections of the labyrinth as they went. It wasn't easy work. The tunnels branched off in unpredictable directions, sometimes ending abruptly in solid rock or leading into dead ends filled with rubble. But despite the challenges, no one complained. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to uncover something truly extraordinary, or so they thought. It was Rachel who noticed it first. As they rounded yet another corner, she stopped suddenly, pointing her flashlight at the wall ahead. "Wait," she said, her voice soft but urgent. Everyone froze, turning their lights toward where she was looking. At first glance, it didn't seem particularly remarkable, just another stretch of rough-hewn stone. But then they saw it. Faint markings etched into the surface, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. Daniel stepped closer, squinting. "What are those?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Rachel replied, already pulling out her notebook. She ran her fingers lightly over the grooves, feeling their texture. "They're not natural. Someone carved these, or maybe something did. The symbols were strange, unlike anything any of them had ever seen before. They weren't letters or numbers, but rather intricate patterns that seemed to flow together in a way that defied logic. Some looked like spirals, others like jagged lightning bolts, and still others resembled shapes that couldn't quite be named. What made them even stranger was the way they appeared to shimmer faintly under the light, as though they were alive. Laura leaned in, her brow furrowed. "Do you think they mean something like a code or a message?" "It's possible," Rachel admitted. "But I've never seen anything like this before. It doesn't match any known writing system." Jake crossed his arms, frowning. "Could it be some kind of warning? Maybe we should turn back." "No," Daniel said firmly. He had led expeditions like this before, and he wasn't about to let fear stop them now. "We didn't come all this way just to leave because of some weird carvings. Let's keep going. Stay alert, though." As they continued down the tunnel, the markings began to appear more frequently, covering entire sections of the walls. Further they went, the more elaborate they became, forming complex designs that seemed to pulse faintly with an inner light. It was unsettling, to say the least, but also undeniably fascinating. None of them could look away. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a large chamber. It was bigger than anything they had encountered so far, its ceiling disappearing into shadow high above. In the center of the room stood something that made everyone gasp, a massive metallic pod, sleek and futuristic, resting on a raised platform of stone. It looked completely out of place in the ancient surroundings, like a piece of advanced technology dropped into the past by mistake. "What is that?" Kevin whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Daniel approached cautiously, shining his flashlight over the surface of the pod. It was smooth and polished, reflecting the light like a mirror. There were no visible seams or openings, just a single glowing symbol embedded in the center. "It's some kind of container," he said. "Maybe a storage unit or a cryopod." "A cryopod?" Laura echoed, incredulous. That's impossible. We're talking about technology far beyond anything humans have ever developed. Unless it's not human, Rachel murmured, staring at the symbol. Something about it tugged at the edges of her mind, as if she'd seen it somewhere before but couldn't quite place it. Kevin shook his head. This has to be fake, some kind of hoax. There's no way. Before he could finish, the symbol on the pod flared brightly, startling everyone. For a moment, the entire chamber was bathed in a soft blue light. Then, with a low hum, the pod began to shift. Panels slid open silently, revealing the figure inside. At first, none of them moved. They simply stared, too shocked to react. The person, if that was even the right word, was humanoid, with features that could easily pass for human. He wore a suit made of some kind of material none of them recognized, sleek and form-fitting, with faint lines of light running along the seams. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were closed as if he were asleep. Is he alive? Laura asked hesitantly. I don't know, Daniel said, stepping closer. He reached out tentatively, as if to touch the figure, but stopped himself at the last second. Should we wake him? Rachel hesitated, her instincts telling her this was dangerous, but curiosity won out. We can't just leave him here, she said finally. If he's alive, we owe it to him to try. With great care, Daniel pressed the glowing symbol again. The pod responded immediately, the hum growing louder as the remaining panels retracted fully. Slowly, the figure stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. When he finally focused on them, his expression was one of confusion, and then recognition. You shouldn't have awakened me, he said in a low, raspy voice. His words were clear, spoken in perfect English, though his accent was unfamiliar. Not yet. Who are you? Daniel demanded, trying to mask his unease. And what is this place? The man sat up slowly, wincing as if his body ached. My name is Ethan Cole, he said. And this is the Labyrinth, a prison and a tomb. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. No one spoke for a long moment, each member of the team grappling with the implications of what they had just heard. Whatever secrets this place held, they were far darker and far older than any of them had anticipated. Ethan Cole sat on the edge of the cryopod, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked around the chamber, taking in the walls covered with glowing symbols and the faces of the people standing before him. His expression was calm, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes, as if he carried the weight of centuries on his shoulders. The team stared back at him, unsure whether to trust him or run for their lives. Where am I? Ethan asked finally, his voice quiet but steady. How did you find this place? Daniel exchanged a glance with Rachel before stepping forward. We're explorers, he explained. We came here to map the labyrinth. No one knew this thing existed until today. Ethan nodded slowly, as though he had expected this answer. You shouldn't have come, he said again, his tone heavier this time. This place isn't safe, not for you, not for anyone. What do you mean? Laura asked, her voice trembling slightly. She clutched her flashlight tightly, as if it could protect her from whatever danger Ethan seemed to sense. What is this place, and who are you, really? Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to clear his thoughts. My name is Ethan Cole, he repeated. I was part of a mission, a very long time ago. We were sent here to explore the labyrinth and contain it. Contain what? Kevin interrupted, his voice rising. You're talking like this place is alive or something. In a way it is, Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on Kevin. The labyrinth isn't just a maze, it's a gateway, a connection to other realms, places humans weren't meant to see. Rachel frowned, flipping through her notebook. Other realms? You mean like alternate dimensions? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but it's more complicated than that. These gates aren't stable. They leak things that don't belong here. The room fell silent as everyone processed his words. Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder at the dark tunnel they had come from. "So, what happened to your team?" he asked. "If you were supposed to contain this place, why are you still here?" Ethan's face darkened, and for a moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We failed. One by one, my crew. They disappeared. Some went mad. Others—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that I stayed behind to seal the gates. But something went wrong and I ended up trapped in that pod." Laura swallowed hard, her mind racing. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Decades? Centuries?" "Longer," Ethan said simply. "Time works differently in this place. For me, it might have been years or millennia. I don't know anymore." Kevin took a step back, shaking his head. "This is insane. None of this makes any sense. Gates to other worlds, people disappearing, it sounds like science fiction." "It's not fiction," Ethan said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And if you stay here, you'll see exactly how real it is." The group exchanged uneasy glances. None of them wanted to believe Ethan's story, but there was something about the way he spoke, calm and measured, that made it impossible to dismiss outright. Even Daniel, who prided himself on being skeptical, couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far bigger than they could comprehend. "We need proof," Rachel said suddenly, breaking the silence. "If what you're saying is true, show us. Take us to one of these gates." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood up, brushing dust off his suit. "Fine," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and began walking toward one of the tunnels leading out of the chamber. The team hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. Finally, Daniel nodded, gesturing for them to follow. "Stay close," he said, "and keep your lights ready." The tunnel Ethan led them down was narrower than the ones they had explored earlier, its walls slick with moisture. The air grew colder the further they went, and the faint glow of the symbols on the walls seemed dimmer, almost reluctant to illuminate their path. Every step felt heavier, as though the labyrinth itself was resisting their presence. After several minutes of walking, Ethan stopped abruptly. He pointed ahead where the tunnel opened into another large chamber. This one was different from the first. It was darker, eerier, and filled with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. In the center of the room stood a massive stone archway, its surface covered in intricate carvings similar to the ones they had seen earlier. But unlike those, these markings pulsed with a faint red light, casting an unnatural glow across the chamber. "That's one of the gates," Ethan said quietly, his voice tinged with both awe and dread. "It's dormant now, but it won't stay that way forever." Jake stepped closer, examining the archway with a mixture of fascination and fear. "How does it work?" he asked. "Is it some kind of portal?" "In theory, yes," Ethan replied. "But using it would be suicide. The entities on the other side, they're not friendly. They'll tear apart anything that crosses into their realm." Laura shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Why would anyone build something like this?" she asked. "What's the point of opening doors to places full of monsters?" "They weren't always monsters," Ethan said cryptically. "Once, they were explorers like us. Curious, hungry, for knowledge. But the labyrinth changed them, twisted them." Kevin let out a bitter laugh. "So what you're saying is, we should just leave this thing alone? Seal it up and pretend it never existed?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Ethan snapped, his patience wearing thin. "The labyrinth wasn't built for humans. It's older than our species, older than anything we can imagine. Messing with it will only end in disaster." Rachel frowned, studying the gate intently. "But if we seal it, how do we know it won't open again? What if someone else finds it later?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's why I stayed behind, to make sure no one else ever came here, but now—" He trailed off, glancing at the team. "Now I don't know what to do." Daniel stepped forward, his expression grim. "We can't just leave it unguarded. If what you're saying is true, this place could destroy the world if it falls into the wrong hands." And what do you suggest we do? Ethan shot back. Destroy it? Seal it permanently? Neither option is foolproof. Before anyone could respond, a low rumble echoed through the chamber, causing the ground beneath their feet to tremble. The red light from the gate grew brighter, pulsing faster and faster until it was almost blinding. Shadows flickered along, the edges of the room moving too quickly to track. What's happening? Laura cried, backing away instinctively. Ethan's face paled. It's waking up, he said, his voice tight with panic. We need to leave. Now. Without waiting for a response, he turned and sprinted back toward the tunnel, motioning for the others to follow. The team didn't hesitate. They ran as fast as they could, their flashlights bouncing wildly as the rumbling grew louder behind them. The labyrinth seemed to come alive around them, the walls shifting and groaning as if angry at their intrusion. When they finally reached the safety of the original chamber, they collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The trembling subsided, gradually, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. What was that? Kevin demanded, his voice shaking. Was that whatever's on the other side? No, Ethan said, his voice barely audible. That was just a taste of what's coming. If we don't act soon, the gates will open fully and then there'll be no stopping it. The group fell silent, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. Whatever they had stumbled upon, it was far more dangerous than they had imagined. And now, they were caught in the middle of it. The team sat in silence for a long time, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The chamber felt different now, colder, heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on them. Ethan stood apart from the group, his back turned as he stared at the glowing symbols on the walls. His posture was tense, his hands clenched into fists. It was clear he was wrestling with something, some decision that weighed heavily on him. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. What happens next? She asked, her voice soft but firm. If we can't seal the gates and we can't leave them open, what are our options? Ethan didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his face was grim. There's one option, he said. But it's risky, very risky. What is it? Daniel asked, leaning forward. He had taken charge of the group since they entered the labyrinth, and he wasn't about to let fear stop him now. Tell us. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. The gates can be stabilized temporarily using the same technology that powers my suit. If I reactivate the system embedded in my armor, I might be able to reinforce the barriers keeping the entities contained. But it won't last forever. How long? Jake asked, frowning. A few hours, days, maybe weeks, Ethan admitted. But eventually the energy will run out. And when it does... He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Laura shook her head, her expression troubled. That doesn't solve anything. We're just delaying the problem. It buys us time, Ethan countered. Time to figure out a permanent solution, or at least warn others about what's coming. Kevin snorted, crossing his arms. Warn who? Who's going to believe us? We'll sound like lunatics talking about portals and monsters. He's right, Daniel said, shooting Kevin a sharp look. But that doesn't mean we have a choice. If Ethan's telling the truth, and I think he is, we can't just walk away and hope for the best. Rachel nodded, flipping through her notebook. We need more information. Maybe there's something in these symbols that can help us understand how the gates work, or how to close them permanently. Ethan glanced at her, a flicker of respect in his eyes. You're smarter than most people I've met, he said. But decoding those symbols won't be easy. They're not just writing, they're alive. They adapt, change, depending on who's reading them. That's impossible, Laura muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. After everything they'd seen so far, nothing seemed truly impossible anymore. We don't have much time, Ethan reminded them. The gate we saw earlier, it's already destabilizing. If we wait too long, it'll open completely and whatever's on the other side will come through. Daniel stood up, brushing dirt off his pants. Then we don't wait. We act now. Ethan, you said your suit can stabilize the gates. How do we do that? Ethan hesitated again, clearly reluctant to explain. Finally, he unzipped part of his suit, revealing a small device attached to his chest. It was sleek and metallic, with glowing lines that matched the patterns on the walls. "This is the core of my armor," he said. "It syncs with the gates and channels energy into them. But activating it isn't easy. It drains me both physically and mentally. And once it's done, there's no turning back." "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, her brow furrowed. "I mean," Ethan said, his voice low, "that stabilizing the gates ties me to them. If I try to leave the labyrinth afterward, the connection will break and everything I've done will unravel." "So you're stuck here?" Laura asked, horrified. "Forever?" Ethan nodded. "If that's what it takes." The group fell silent again, each person grappling with the enormity of what Ethan was proposing. Sacrificing himself to save the world, or at least delay its destruction, wasn't something any of them had expected. But deep down, they knew it might be their only chance. "We'll help you," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence. "Whatever you need, we'll do it." Ethan looked at him, surprised. "Why would you risk your lives for this? You don't owe me anything." "Because it's the right thing to do," Daniel replied simply. "And because if we don't, none of us are getting out of here alive anyway." Ethan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, here's the plan. We go back to the gate and I'll activate the core. While I'm doing that, I need all of you to keep an eye out for anything unusual. Shadows, movements, sounds, the entities on the other side. They'll try to stop us." "No pressure," Kevin muttered under his breath, earning a glare from Daniel. They gathered their gear and prepared to move out. As they retraced their steps toward the gate, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the faint hum of energy in the air made their skin prickle. Even Ethan, who had been calm until now, looked uneasy. When they reached the chamber with the gate, the red light was pulsing even faster, casting eerie shadows across the room. The carvings on the archway shifted subtly as if alive, twisting into new shapes every few seconds. It was mesmerizing and terrifying. "This is it," Ethan said, stepping toward the gate. He placed his hand on the surface of the archway, closing his eyes as if focusing. Slowly, the device on his chest began to glow brighter, matching the rhythm of the light from the gate. "What's happening?" Laura whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "He's syncing with it," Rachel replied, her voice barely audible. She was scribbling furiously in her notebook, trying to capture every detail of the process. Suddenly, the ground trembled violently, knocking everyone off balance. A loud screeching sound filled the chamber, high-pitched and unbearable. Shadows darted along the edges of the room, moving too quickly to follow. They weren't ordinary shadows. They were distorted, humanoid shapes, reaching out with claw-like fingers. "They're here," Kevin shouted, backing away instinctively. "Stay focused," Daniel yelled, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "Ethan, hurry!" Ethan didn't respond. His entire body was rigid, his face contorted in pain as the energy surged between him and the gate. The red light dimmed slightly, replaced by a steady blue glow. But the shadows kept coming, circling closer and closer. One of the figures lunged at Jake, who barely managed to dodge. He swung his flashlight wildly, driving it back momentarily. "We can't hold them off forever," he shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "We don't have to," Ethan gritted out, his voice strained, just a little longer. The blue light spread outward, engulfing the gate and pushing the shadows back. For a brief moment, the chamber was bathed in calm, serene light. Then, with a final burst of energy, the gate stabilized, its surface smooth and inert once more. Ethan staggered backward, collapsing to his knees. The device on his chest flickered weakly before going dark. He looked exhausted, his face pale and sweaty, but he managed a weak smile. "It's done," he said. "For now." The team rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. They all knew the battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. And as they stared at the now quiet gate, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far greater and far darker. than they could ever imagine. The team stayed close to Ethan as they made their way back to the central chamber where they had first found him. None of them spoke much. The weight of what they had just witnessed, and survived, was still sinking in. The shadows, the screeching, sounds, the feeling of being watched. It all lingered in their minds like a bad dream they couldn't shake. Even Ethan, who seemed to know more about this place than anyone else, looked uneasy. His steps were slower now, his movements careful, as if he was carrying a heavy burden. When they reached the chamber, Daniel turned to Ethan. "You said earlier that these gates connect to other realms. Can you tell us more? What exactly are we dealing with here?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at the walls covered in glowing symbols. "It's hard to explain," he said finally. "These gates aren't just doors, they're fractures, tearing holes between dimensions. When they open, things slip through. Not just creatures, but ideas, emotions, fragments of other worlds." Laura frowned, hugging her arms around herself. "Fragments? You mean like pieces of another reality?" "Exactly," Ethan replied. "But those fragments don't belong here. They warp everything they touch, people, places, even time itself. That's why why they didn't survive." Kevin shook his head, pacing back and forth. "This is insane. How can something like this exist? Who built it? And why?" Ethan sighed, sitting down on the edge of the cryopod. "No one knows for sure. The labyrinth predates humanity. Maybe it was created by some ancient civilization, or maybe it's older than life itself. All I know is that it wasn't meant for us. Humans weren't supposed to find it." "But we did," Rachel said softly, flipping through her notebook. "And now we have to deal with it. Is there any way to destroy the gates permanently?" Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Destroying them would be dangerous. If we break the wrong thing, we could tear the entire labyrinth apart, and maybe the world with it." "So what do we do?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Just sit here and wait for the gates to destabilize again?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "We need to understand them better. Find out how they work, why they exist. Knowledge is our best weapon right now." Rachel nodded, her eyes lighting up. "The symbols, they might hold answers if I can decipher them." "It won't be easy," Ethan warned. "Those symbols aren't static. They change based on the reader's intent. Some people see patterns, others see chaos. It depends on how your mind processes information." "That's impossible," Kevin muttered, throwing up his hands. "Nothing makes sense anymore. First talking suits, then shadow monsters, and now magic symbols. This isn't science. It's a nightmare." "It's not magic," Ethan snapped, his patience wearing thin. "It's advanced technology. Or maybe something beyond technology. Either way, dismissing it won't make it go away." Daniel stepped in before the argument could escalate. "Enough. We don't have time for this. Rachel, focus on the symbols. Laura, keep an eye on Ethan. Make sure he doesn't collapse again. Jake, check our equipment. Kevin, stop complaining and help me scout the tunnels. We need to know if there are more gates nearby." The group scattered, each person taking on their assigned task. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, her notebook balanced on her knees as she studied the glowing symbols on the walls. She traced their shapes with her finger, muttering under her breath as she tried to find patterns or meanings. The symbols shifted subtly as she worked, sometimes forming recognizable shapes, other times dissolving into chaotic lines. It was frustrating, but also strangely fascinating. Meanwhile, Laura hovered near Ethan, watching him closely. He leaned against the cryopod, his face pale but determined. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. "I've been better," he admitted with a weak smile. "But I'll live, for now." Jake inspected their gear, checking batteries and recalibrating sensors. The tremors earlier had caused some malfunctions, and he wanted to make sure everything was working properly. As he tinkered, he noticed something strange, a faint humming noise coming from one of the devices. At first he thought it was interference, but when he examined it closer, he realized it was picking up signals from somewhere deep within the labyrinth. "Guys," he called out, holding up the device. I think there's another gate nearby. Daniel and Kevin returned moments later, both looking tense. We found something too, Daniel said. There's a tunnel branching off to the east. It leads to another chamber, but we didn't go inside. Something felt wrong. Ethan stood up, wincing slightly. Show me. The group followed Daniel and Kevin through the tunnel, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder the further they went, and the walls seemed to press in on them, narrowing the passage until they had to walk single file. Finally, they emerged into another large chamber, similar to the one with the first gate. But this one was different. Instead of a single archway, there were 3 smaller gates arranged in a triangle, their surfaces shimmering with a sickly green light. This wasn't here before, Ethan said, his voice tight with unease. These gates shouldn't exist. What do you mean? Laura asked, her voice trembling. Didn't you say there were multiple gates? Yes, but not like this, Ethan replied. They're unstable, unfinished. Someone or something is trying to create new ones. Who would do that? Rachel asked, horrified. And why? Ethan shook his head. I don't know, but it's bad news. Every new gate weakens the barriers between dimensions. If this keeps up, the entire labyrinth could collapse. Then we stop it, Daniel said firmly. Whatever's causing this, we shut it down. It's not that simple, Ethan warned. Creating gates requires immense power. Whoever's doing this has access to resources we can't even imagine. We don't have a choice, Daniel shot back. If we don't try, we're all dead anyway. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, here's what we'll do. Rachel, keep working on the symbols. Maybe you can find a way to disrupt the process. Jake, see if you can track the source of the energy. Laura, stay with me. We'll monitor the gates and make sure they don't destabilize. And me? Kevin asked, his voice bitter. What am I supposed to do? You'll help Daniel scout the area, Ethan replied. We need eyes everywhere. Kevin opened his mouth to protest, but shut it when Daniel gave him a sharp look. Reluctantly, he nodded. As the team split up again, the tension in the air was palpable. Each person knew the stakes were higher than ever. The labyrinth was no longer just a mysterious place. It was a ticking time bomb, and they were running out of time to defuse it. Rachel returned to the central chamber, focusing intently on the symbols. Hours passed as she worked, her fingers moving furiously across the pages of her notebook. Slowly, patterns began to emerge, connections between the shapes and the energy flowing through the labyrinth. It was exhausting, but she refused to give up. Somewhere in these markings, she was sure, lay the key to stopping whatever was happening. Meanwhile, Jake followed the signal from his device, venturing deeper into the labyrinth. The tunnels twisted and turned unpredictably, leading him to places he hadn't seen before. Finally, he reached a small room filled with strange machinery, devices unlike anything he had ever encountered. They hummed with energy, their surfaces etched with the same glowing symbols as the walls. This has to be it, he whispered, pulling out his camera to document everything. As he took pictures, he noticed something odd. One of the machines had a screen displaying a map of the labyrinth, with blinking dots marking the locations of the gates. One dot, however, was larger and brighter than the others, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Jake's blood ran cold. Whatever that dot represented, it was the source of the problem. And judging by its position on the map, it was far beneath them, deep in the heart of the labyrinth. He hurried back to the others, his mind racing. When he reached the central chamber, he found everyone gathered around Rachel, who was holding up her notebook triumphantly. I think I figured it out, she said, her voice shaking with excitement. The symbols, their instructions, a way to disrupt the gate's connection to the other realms. Ethan's eyes widened. Are you sure? I'm pretty sure, Rachel replied, but we'll need to get close to the source to activate it, otherwise it won't work. The source is deeper in the labyrinth, Jake said quickly, showing them the map. We need to move fast. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. Then, let's go. But remember, This place will fight back. Harder than before. No one argued. They grabbed their gear and prepared to descend even deeper into the labyrinth, knowing full well that what awaited them might be beyond their understanding or their ability to survive. The journey deeper into the labyrinth was unlike anything the team had experienced so far. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls seemed to close in around them, narrowing the tunnels until they could barely walk side by side. The faint glow of the symbols on the walls dimmed, leaving their flashlights as the only source of light. Shadows danced at the edges of their beams, twisting and shifting in ways that made it hard to tell if they were real or just tricks of the mind. Ethan led the way, his movement slow but deliberate. He carried a small device in his hand, a tool from his suit that emitted a soft blue light. It pulsed faintly, growing brighter whenever they approached something important. "This will guide us," he said over his shoulder. "It reacts to the energy in the labyrinth." "Energy?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean like power lines?" "Sort of," Ethan replied. "But this isn't electricity, it's something older, something alive." Jake frowned, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "Alive? You're saying the labyrinth is conscious?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "Maybe not in the way we think of consciousness. But it knows we're here. And it doesn't want us to succeed." Kevin muttered something under his breath, though no one could make out the words. His face was pale, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to jump out at them. Daniel noticed but didn't say anything. They all had their own ways of dealing with fear, and Kevin's sarcasm was better than panic. Rachel walked behind Ethan, clutching her notebook tightly. She had memorized the patterns she'd deciphered earlier, but the labyrinth's complexity still worried her. "What happens if we get lost?" she asked quietly. "We won't," Ethan said firmly. "As long as we follow the device, we'll stay on track." They continued downward, the ground sloping steeply now. The hum of energy grew louder, vibrating through the soles of their shoes. Every few minutes, the tunnel would branch off in multiple directions, but Ethan always chose the correct path without hesitation. It was as if he could sense where they needed to go. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a massive chamber. It was larger than any they had seen before, its ceiling disappearing into darkness high above. In the center of the room stood a towering structure, a machine unlike anything they had ever encountered. Its surface was covered in glowing symbols that shifted and changed constantly, forming intricate patterns that defied logic. At its base was a console, pulsing with the same rhythmic heartbeat Jake had seen on the map. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice heavy with both awe and dread. "The source." Daniel stepped forward, shining his flashlight on the machine. "So this is what's powering the gates?" "Yes," Ethan replied, "and destabilizing them. Whoever or whatever is controlling this machine is trying to tear the barriers between dimensions apart." "Can we shut it down?" Laura asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but it won't be easy. The machine is tied directly to the labyrinth. Disrupting it could cause a chain reaction." "What kind of chain reaction?" Kevin demanded, his voice rising. "A collapse," Ethan said simply. "The entire labyrinth could implode." Everyone fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. None of them wanted to die here, buried beneath miles of rock. But staying wasn't an option either, not if it meant letting the gates open fully. "We don't have a choice," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence. "If we don't stop this, the world above ground will suffer too. Millions of lives are at stake." Rachel nodded, flipping through her notebook. "I can do it," she said. "The symbols I decoded, they're instructions for disabling the machine, but I'll need time." "How much time?" Jake asked, glancing nervously at the shadows creeping along the edges of the chamber. 10 minutes, Rachel replied. "Maybe less if I work quickly." Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "All right, we'll hold them off while you work." "Hold who off?" Kevin asked, his voice sharp with panic. "The entities," Ethan said grimly. "They'll come, they always do." Before anyone could respond, The machine let out a low hum, growing louder with each passing second. The symbols on its surface began to pulse faster, casting an eerie red glow across the chamber. Shadows flickered along the walls, coalescing into humanoid shapes that moved with unnatural speed. "They're here," Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency. "Get to work, Rachel. Everyone else, stay alert." Rachel rushed to the console, her hands trembling as she traced the glowing symbols with her fingers. She worked quickly, following the patterns she had memorized, her mind racing to keep up with the shifting designs. Each touch sent a ripple of energy through the machine, causing it to shudder violently. Meanwhile, the rest of the team formed a loose circle around her, their flashlights pointed outward. The shadows closed in, their claw-like hands reaching out hungrily. One of them lunged at Kevin, who swung his flashlight wildly, driving it back momentarily. "These things aren't giving up," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Stay focused," Daniel yelled, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "We can't let them near Rachel." Jake fired off a flare gun, the bright light temporarily blinding the entities and forcing them to retreat. "How much longer?" he called out to Rachel. 5 minutes, she replied, her voice strained. "Just hold them off a little longer." The battle intensified as more shadows poured into the chamber, their screeching cries echoing off the walls. Laura stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance, but Ethan caught her arm, steadying her. "Keep moving," he urged. "Don't let them surround us." Despite their efforts, the creatures kept coming, relentless and unyielding. It was clear they weren't just attacking, they were trying to protect the machine. Every time someone got too close, the shadows swarmed, forcing them back. Finally, Rachel let out a triumphant cry. "I did it. I disrupted the connection." The machine shuddered violently, its glow fading rapidly. The symbols on its surface froze, then shattered like glass, scattering shards of light across the floor. The shadows screamed in unison, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the energy sustaining them vanished. For a brief moment, the chamber was silent. Then, with a deafening roar, the ground began to tremble. Cracks spread across the walls, and chunks of stone rained down from the ceiling. "It's collapsing," Ethan shouted. "We need to move now." The team didn't hesitate. They grabbed Rachel and sprinted toward the tunnel they had entered through, dodging falling debris as they went. The labyrinth groaned around them, its ancient structure giving way under the strain. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe, but they pushed on, driven by sheer desperation. When they finally emerged into the central chamber, they collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The tremors subsided gradually, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. None of them spoke. They simply stared at each other, too exhausted to process what had just happened. "We did it," Laura whispered finally, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually stopped it." "For now," Ethan corrected, his expression grim. "The gates are sealed, but the labyrinth is still here, and so am I." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of Ethan's words. "We'll leave evidence behind. Maps, notes, recordings. Someone needs to know about this place and how to deal with it if it wakes again." Ethan smiled faintly, though there was sadness in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." The team packed up their gear and prepared to leave, knowing they couldn't stay any longer. As they climbed upward, retracing their steps through the labyrinth, none of them looked back. They had faced the impossible and survived, but they knew the memory of this place would haunt them forever. The journey back to the surface was long and exhausting. The labyrinth no longer felt alive. It was quieter now, its energy drained after the collapse of the machine. But even in its silence, the team couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder, as if the labyrinth was holding its breath, waiting for them to leave. Ethan walked at the back of the group, his steps slower than before. His suit's glow had dimmed significantly, and his face was pale, drawn with exhaustion. He didn't complain, though. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, occasionally glancing at the walls as if saying a silent goodbye. Rachel carried her notebook tightly against her chest, her fingers gripping it as if it might slip away. She hadn't stopped thinking about the symbols she had deciphered, the patterns that had allowed them to disable the machine. "Do you think we'll ever understand what this place really is?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Ethan shook his head. "Probably not," he replied. "Some things aren't meant to be understood. The Labyrinth, it's older than us, older than anything. It's a relic of something beyond human comprehension. That's comforting," Kevin muttered under his breath, earning a glare from Daniel. "Focus on getting out," Daniel said sharply. "We can worry about the rest later." The team pressed on, climbing through tunnels and chambers they had explored days or maybe weeks ago. Time had become meaningless underground, where the only measure of it was the steady rhythm of their footsteps and the flickering beams of their flashlights. Finally, after hours of walking, they saw it, the faint outline of daylight filtering through an opening above them. "It's the exit," Laura whispered, her voice filled with relief. She quickened her pace, her legs trembling with fatigue but unwilling to slow down now. As they emerged into the open air, the sunlight hit their faces like a warm embrace. They blinked against the brightness, their eyes adjusting slowly after so long in the dark. The world outside felt alien, too big, too bright, and yet overwhelmingly beautiful. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive stillness of the Labyrinth. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. "We made it," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "We actually made it." Kevin sank to the ground, leaning against a tree trunk. "I never thought I'd see sunlight again," he admitted, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine gratitude. Laura hugged herself, tears streaming down her face. "It feels like a dream," she said. "Like none of it was real." "It was real," Ethan reminded her gently. "Every moment of it." Rachel looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "What happens now? To you?" Ethan hesitated, then gestured toward the entrance behind them. "I'll stay here," he said simply. "Someone needs to make sure no one else goes in. Not unless they're ready." "You can't stay here forever," Jake protested. "You'll die." "I've already lived longer than I should have," Ethan replied with a faint smile. "This is where I belong now." The team fell silent, unable to argue with the quiet certainty in his voice. They knew he was right. He had sacrificed everything to protect them, and now he was choosing to sacrifice himself again. It wasn't fair, but it was his decision. "We'll tell people," Rachel said finally. "About the Labyrinth, about the gates. Someone will figure out how to deal with it. Properly," Ethan nodded. "Good. But be careful who you trust. Not everyone will understand." Daniel stepped forward, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "For everything." Ethan shook his hand firmly, then turned away, disappearing, back into the shadows of the entrance. None of them called after him. They knew there was nothing left to say. Days passed as the team made their way back to civilization. They traveled in silence for the most part, each person lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the nearest town, they split up temporarily to gather supplies and recover, but they reconvened soon after, determined to document everything they had seen. Rachel spent hours typing up notes, carefully organizing her sketches of the symbols and her observations of the Labyrinth. She included detailed instructions on how to disable the machine, hoping someone smarter than her could improve upon her work. Jake worked on repairing their equipment, ensuring all their recordings and photographs were intact. Laura helped create maps of the Labyrinth's layout, marking key locations like the gates and the central chamber. Kevin, surprisingly, took charge of writing a summary of their experience, his sharp wit adding clarity to their chaotic journey. And Daniel oversaw everything, making sure nothing was overlooked. When they were finished, they stored the documents in a secure location, a hidden vault accessible only to trusted individuals. They also uploaded encrypted copies online, spreading the information across multiple servers in case something happened to the physical records. But despite their efforts, none of them felt truly at peace. The Labyrinth lingered in their minds, its secrets haunting their dreams. They tried to move on with their lives, returning to their jobs and routines, but they couldn't escape the feeling that they had left something unfinished. Months later, Rachel received an anonymous email. It contained a single line of text: "The gates are stirring." Attached was a blurry photograph of glowing symbols etched into stone, symbols eerily similar to the ones they had seen in the labyrinth. Her heart sank as she forwarded the message to the others. None of them needed to discuss what it meant. The labyrinth wasn't done with them, not yet. The team reunited quietly, meeting in a secluded cabin far from prying eyes. They brought along the documents they had prepared, knowing they might need them again soon. As they sat around the table, the weight of their shared experience hung heavy in the air. "What do we do now?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wait," Daniel replied, "and prepare. If the gates are waking up again, we'll need to act fast." Rachel nodded, clutching her notebook tightly. "At least we know what to expect this time." "Do we?" Kevin countered bitterly. "Because last time almost killed us." "It doesn't matter," Daniel said firmly. "We can't ignore this. Not if we want to protect the people above ground." No one argued. They all knew he was right. Whatever awaited them next, they would face it together, as a team. As night fell, they sat in silence, staring out at the stars. The world above ground seemed peaceful, unaware of the darkness lurking beneath its surface. But the team knew better. They had seen it, fought it, and barely survived. And they knew it wasn't over. Somewhere deep below, the labyrinth stirred, its ancient energy beginning to pulse once more. The symbols on its walls glowed faintly, shifting into new patterns. The gates remained sealed for now, but the barriers between dimensions were weakening. And somewhere within the labyrinth, Ethan Cole stood watch. His suits glowed dim but steady. He didn't expect anyone to come looking for him, not yet. But when they did, he would be ready, because some battles are never truly won. Some doors once opened cannot be closed, and some humans, no matter how ordinary they seem, are destined to carry the weight of extraordinary choices.